Hi, I'm Kate.
And I'm Jen.
And this is Chamomile and Clove, our All Souls podcast. Today we are discussing chapters 10 through 12 of A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. And we have really enjoyed hearing your feedback about the last couple episodes. I'm going to go ahead and confess something that just happened here on Chamomile and Clove, which is to say that we recorded a lovely 45-minute listener feedback episode, which apparently my computer didn't want to keep. So I'm sorry, guys. It's going to be a little while. We'll figure it out. I will get it to you as soon as
We've
possible.
had a little bit of a session.
We have had a session already, but we are ready to talk to you about chapters 10 through 12. And one of the things that we noticed about chapters 10 through 12 is that they have a lot of plot movement going on, but not a ton of other stuff. And so we think that there's some functional stuff and there's some swoony stuff, so we are calling this functionally swoony.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And what we get in these three chapters is sort of a little bit of pushing the plot forward and then a little bit of pushing the romantic plot forward. So as a brief summary, what we have is that canonically chapter 10 takes place at the same time as chapter 9. So Matthew is in Scotland. Diana is back in Oxford. She has a phone call with Sarah and M where they berate her about not being sufficiently witchy. And then she decides that she's going to go back to the library, and she is confronted by Miriam, who tells her that he is hunting and that he is gone. There are many, many, many creatures in the Bodleian who are trying to get a hold of Diana now that Matthew is not present. She meets Peter Knox for the first time, really understands who Peter Knox is, at least in terms of that he is a witch, and he's the witch that tried to get inside of her head. And so she does a little bit of studying, then gets threatened by a second witch, Gillian Chamberlain, and then we find out that Peter Knox has contrived to get Diana into Professor Marsh's rooms for an evening glass of sherry, where he threatens her once again about the manuscript. After that unfortunate dinner engagement, Diana calls Matthew and says, "Hey, I met Peter Knox in the library," and ostensibly in chapter 11, that is when Matthew comes back. Miriam finds herself wishing that she were larger. Matthew comes back and they have this conversation about what they've both been doing and about Matthew's pilgrim's badge, which is, as we discover, an ampulla from Bethany. And at some point, Diana has sort of this wild fit of fancy where she decides to invite Matthew over to dinner to her rooms. And chapter 12 is basically How to Date a Vampire 101 a la Diana Bishop. And she essentially ends the evening after much flirting, much wine, a little bit of raw food. And she ends the evening where he kisses her in the French way. And she sort of melts against the back of the door going, "Oh my, what have I done?" And
heavy dose of swoon.
Heavy swoon, although, we don't get into, full prostrate on the fainting couch swoon until chapter 14, really, when she has dinner at Matthew's. In any case, we have talked a little bit about the structure of this book and the places where we think Deborah Harkness is a little bit less experienced and less well-versed in the narrative craft. And we have discussed on this podcast the fact that Jen and I have competing ideas about where the inciting incident for these books is. And so for me, I think that for the Diana versus the rest of the universe and the world of creatures plot, I think that Peter Knox threatening her in the library and then inviting her to Marsh's rooms and contriving that moment of antagonism is the place where that larger conflict begins. But you have a different opinion, and what is that?
I do. My feeling for the inciting incident for the book series for the Diana versus Creatures story is actually in chapter 1 with the discovery of Ashmole 782. And I think I could see the argument for the inciting incident for this book being in perhaps the first introduction of Peter Knox in the library and then tied to this second time that we meet him. But I'm not sure. Yeah, I would call the first chapter the inciting incident for the series to me.
And I think there's a strong argument for that. I think for me, structurally, this book breaks down into three main plots, one of them being sort of Diana versus the world of creatures, one being Diana versus herself, and the other being Diana and Matthew, the romance and the beginning of the conflict that really does span 3 books. And in my read, structurally, I think that the strongest argument for the inciting incident for the Diana's inner conflict is the moment where she touches the book and the moment where she has to confront everything that she wants to be true and everything that is actually true about her. And that's why I choose that for that plotline as opposed to for the Diana versus the creatures, because for me, I don't think we get enough antagonism from the world of creatures and the society of creatures and the taboos of creature society until we actually get Knox acting on Diana and blocking Diana and not letting Diana go back to where this book hasn't affected her and where Matthew isn't involved, not letting her retreat into her comfort zone in this chapter is where I think that begins.
But, listeners, we do agree on where the Diana Matthew inciting incident is, which is great, which we believe to be, which we talked about a little bit in our last episode and again in episode 3, which has just been released, which is Diana and Matthew on the dock after she's rowing, and then subsequently their breakfast conversation being the beginning of their proper relationship together and the point at which they both recognize the future they could potentially have together.
And to some extent, we get foreshadowing about the kinds of conflicts that will continue to, if not keep them apart, then make their relationship have its own shape as it goes forward, where they certainly both have some very good characteristics and they have some very negative ones. And all of those, I think, are present in those chapters as the beginning of the romance. But you see that shimmering of sort of how they could be really functional together if they just both got over their crap, which I guess is the bottom line of any good romance. So let's start, I guess, in chapter 10 and talking about what Diana is doing when Matthew is in Scotland. So she starts the chapter with this conversation that she has with Em and Sarah, and I wanted to ask whether you think that Em and Sarah are being, well, Sarah in particular, whether she's being fair here.
I think Sarah's being fair with regards to Diana's kind of cavalier attitude towards magical artifacts and magic, and reminding her, and my appreciation of Sarah, of course, is that she is the reasoning voice and kind of the cold water to Diana, and is reminding her that Diana has wants nothing to do with learning magic in her life or in the past, and so has put herself in this potentially really dangerous situation because of her ignorance and the fact that she chose to be ignorant and now, has potentially mistreated this dangerous magical artifact. So I think she's being fair in that regard. Yes.
I mostly think so too, although I do think that Sarah is being rather obtuse when it comes to what Diana was actually supposed to have done once she got a hold of this manuscript, given that textually we know that Diana's magical capabilities, insofar as she's using magic, it's mostly unconscious, and it's not as though she could have done anything to sort of like spirit the enchanted book away or hide it or like sit on it until Sarah could get there, which is sort of what Sarah's implying, is that Diana should just hatch it until Sarah can make it over from Madison.
And I think it's a little bit like she's angry about it without having a solution to the problem. She just wants to be angry about it, but she's not actually trying to constructively solve the problem. And a little bit she suggests that perhaps if Diana, had a more cultivated relationship with witches, that they could have helped her, etc., is kind of the implication in this conversation as well. So yeah, in that way, yeah, she's just being angry, but she's not being constructive.
And there's a bit of that kind of from Em too, where, this is one of the chapters where while I appreciate Em saying, hey, Sarah, we agreed that Diana can take care of herself. I think that Em's insistence that witches are inherently good and protective and that they are inherently a community that takes care of one another is absolutely and textually refuted in this chapter, and in ways that make it really hard for me to stomach that from Em. Going back and rereading that and being like, are you kidding me? Just because you guys are the same species doesn't mean that you aren't either competitive with one another or that there isn't a certain amount of intra-species danger that is involved.
Yeah, I think it's very naive, and that's not to say that naivete is always negative, because it's not, but in this case it's willful naivety, because I feel like Em knows that that's not true and she just would like it to be true. And it's also kind of like dangerously naive to present this world where all witches are good to each other. And we're like, well, that's false. We know that already.
We know that demonstrably, that all witches are not kind, and that the invitations for Diana to join the community of witches is problematic.
Everyone's
at
just
best.
Glinda. Everyone's Glinda. Males and females. They're all Glinda.
I just had sort of like a Diana's alphabet moment, and it was not wrong, but it wasn't right either. So I don't think that everybody's a good witch. I don't think that everybody is as kind and supportive as Em would like them to be. And so when that's combined with sort of Sarah's sharpness, I think it's one of the places where I am more successfully placed in Diana's indignance over not just their bias, but also like, you're not here and you are not experiencing this world. And I think it's also fair to say that while Em and Sarah textually seem to have a great deal of interaction with the Madison, upstate New York coven, they maybe don't have as much experience with other creatures, like creatures outside of their own community anyway.
Right. And I feel like it is a nice bit of conflict because it's not false. I mean, both parties, both sides of the conversation are right, but they're also both wrong. And so I think that it's a nice little bit of conflict between them. And I think it reads as very real.
And as a marker of conflict, I think that it is certainly helpful that it's not the kind of conflict that can be solved by talking. Like, the talking about it, if they talk about it rationally, they're still not going to come to a place where they agree. So it is a real conflict. It is a real beat in the sense that it narratively, both sides have something they're trying to convey, and those things conflict with one another and butt up against each other. And when they bounce off, you get something different, which is one that Diana, this is partially her own fault because she has chosen to ignore who and what she is, and that perhaps she could have taken better care of herself, but also that perhaps Em and Sarah have a limited worldview, and while they're right about this, they're not always right about how Diana should be conducting herself, at least with respect to interacting with other creatures.
Right. And I think, too, in this conversation, Em and Sarah betray kind of a gross amount of species bias as well, both of them. And so that is very uncomfortable. I can't think of specific quotes, but reading it, you're just kind of like, oh, that's gross.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I think that we've covered that sufficiently that we can sort of say, and move on for now. But there's also some Diana being actively in denial, right? Like on page 113, where she snaps at Em and Sarah and says, "You should be grateful. I might not want to be lectured by Claremont or have breakfast with him again, but the vampire deserved some credit." I call BS on that first one. The lecturing, yes. I do think she probably wants to have breakfast with him again, so I don't think she's being entirely honest about her level of engagement with Matthew Claremont and everything that he represents. I think it's interesting how much being a bishop comes up in this chapter, because Sarah and Em mention it, Peter Knox mentions it, Gillian mentions it. And I think it is a sub-theme of this chapter, that there's something about being a bishop that both creates expectations for other creatures about what Diana is supposed to be doing or how she's supposed to be behaving, and then Diana's own understanding of what it means to be a bishop witch.
And I like to, so Em and Sarah bring up something that we talked about when we talked about Hamish's chapter, which is they bring up the fact that a vampire has now interfered in the business of witches. And I thought it was very interesting. So now we get a witch perspective on what it means in the creature world to interfere in another creature's world.
Absolutely, and having that reinforced from Hamish and from Sarah and Em, I think gives it a great deal of credence, where if Sarah and Em in particular, because of their lack of fluency with the world, the wider world of creatures, I might not have bought into it. I thought it might have been a weird witch thing. And perhaps it is, because even the way that Hamish says it suggests that while it may also be that vampires do vampires, demons do demons, and witches do witches, maybe there's something specific about the community of witches where they mete out their own justice. I think you could say that for vampires too, perhaps, as we go on, but maybe there's also something particular about witch dynamics that you don't mess with.
Yeah, it could be, and I think we can keep track of it as we go on, and even into book 2, I think, is a worthwhile discussion there.
I have a narrative voice and perspective question for you. On page 114, we have this odd narrative insertion from, it sounds like Diana, where she says, "None of us believed that was likely." And I wonder where that comes from. So I think we talked about how you generally believe that the whole narrative is being told at some point in the future by Diana.
Yes. Yes.
And I guess my question is, where, do you know to whom you think she is telling the story?
I don't know if I could say that without giving things away. I think she is potentially telling it to
a future unnamed audience?
People most affected by this unfolding story. Future people most affected by this unfolding story as kind of an account, a historical record, whatever. And I think as we go on, Diana's ability to have knowledge about events that she did not witness will become more apparent and more, I guess, fleshed out in the text how she could do that. And so that's why I find her to be the narrator of the book series.
I think that's fair, and I guess I sort of wonder why the narrative voice decides to intrude so specifically there and give this little bit of textual sort of a nudge, a bit of perspective that is more like and I would come to find out that this was a terrible decision, than you get in other places in the book. And I guess I just wonder if we think that that's meaningful, or if that just happens to be the place where the future Diana that you believe is telling the book is it, I'm having trouble remembering, is that in reference to species bias, or is it in reference to all witches being good, or is it in reference to... It is in reference to whether Diana will stay in Oxford, and that maybe she should come home for a while, let things cool off, and if she doesn't have the manuscript, maybe the rest of the creatures will lose interest, and then you have the "none of us believe that was likely."
Okay. Yeah, I do think it's meaningful in that there is the implication, because some people at this point in the story might be thinking, why doesn't she just leave? And from the witch's perspective, nobody thinks that's going to work. And I think if we asked, Matthew or Hamish or any of the other characters in the book, they would probably agree that it won't matter where you go. This is not something that's just going to go away just simply because you go home.
I think there's an interesting mirroring from chapter 9 in here, where Sarah and Em Em specifically poses the question of Diana needing to figure out what it is that Matthew wants from her. And I think that's an interesting foil to the conversation that Hamish and Matthew have in the chapter before about what exactly it is that Matthew wants. And the placement of those two chapters, I think it would be much more sinister if chapter 10 came before chapter 9. If the two were switched, I think that because we have some foreknowledge of what Matthew at least says that he wants from Diana, we have a different perspective on this than perhaps Diana does herself in this moment.
Right, yeah. And I agree. And I think that makes it really lovely, because then we're not led to believe something sinister, falsely led to believe something sinister, because we already know. We've had this whole Hamish chapter and this whole very emotional and vulnerable conversation. And so having this in here, we can understand why Sarah and Ed would be concerned about that, but we know that it's not a concern.
And perhaps that is how we push back or begin to push back successfully against some of the more troubling aspects of the vampire trope. In the Lost Listener feedback episode, which I'm sure that we will revisit at some point, we talked a lot about vampire tropes, and so I'm not going to rehash that. I think we'll do that at another time, other than to say that the footnote of that conversation is that where Harkness is especially successful at pushing back on the vampire trope, it is when she takes something that looks like it is sinister and contextualizes it to say, oh, okay, I see where this is coming from. And the fact that we already have Matthew having this incredibly emotional and, yeah, he does some wallowing in some self-indulgence in that portion of the book, but he is at least being emotionally aware and thoughtful about why he's doing some of the things that he is doing and what he actually wants out of Diana. And that makes some of the discussion in the next couple chapters that we'll be talking about the thirst for her blood. And now that we've had the conversation with Hamish about the idea of mating, that helps underscore it's not just the Twilight thing where, like, she seems like she's especially tasty. It's that in order to complete this emotional and biological process that vampires as a species go through, they have to want this thing more than they want anything else.
Okay, so I have a question. One of the things Sarah says in this chapter, Diana says in reference to Sarah, is that willful ignorance and dismissing the supernatural are at the top of the list of Sarah's human pet peeves. And I'm like, well, Diana has basically just described herself, but Sarah is only angry about those things when humans do them? Or is she kind of acknowledging the fact that Sarah is also peeved with her for those things, and that Diana's acting like a human and Sarah hates that?
I think that it's option B, and I think it's that Diana is recognizing that one of the reasons that that Sarah is so angry with her is Diana's insistence on trying to be human, which is a thing that she's not. And she wants to be because that is safer to her than being a witch. Because we talked about this in episode 2 about Diana as the hunted and also Diana the huntress, in the play on her name and all of these things that we talk about that associate her with the ancient Diana as an aspect of the goddess, which I don't think we've quite gotten into, but I want to talk a lot about that later in this chapter. And I think that Diana's willful ignorance and her denial of how the world actually works are the things that both frustrate Sarah in general about humans, perhaps unfairly, because to be fair, humans aren't supposed to know about creatures. But when it comes to Diana, I think Diana is aware that that's the thing that peeves Sarah about her. What do you think about the puzzle?
The white table. Yes, I think it is a very interesting device. I find it fascinating that Diana does not think it's magic prior to now, because, apparently she's been doing it for quite some time, if not her whole life, at least since her parents died. And I think it's very interesting, and I think that it's important that she can't find the reasoning at this point just by trying to fit the pieces that she has together, indicating that it is perhaps a larger puzzle, a larger picture than she is yet aware of.
I like that. That had not occurred to me until you said it, that the reason that it doesn't work is that it's bigger than she thinks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she does not have nearly enough information to make even the beginnings of a picture.
So do you think that's why she rejects it? Because she's somewhat comfortable in some sense believing, like, dealing with her own conflict, but the idea that it's a larger conflict is what makes her back off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Because she's used to this being, her solution when she's confused about something, that this is her solution. And if she can't make it fit, she's just kind of like, meh.
Oh my goodness, Jen, that's brilliant. So, so I like this because I like it now. No, the reason that I like a lot of the things you say, but I think that this one has like particular structural significance because structurally in many stories, you start to see character change, or you're coming up against character change when a character tries to solve things using the tools that they already have and they fail. And this is one of the times in this act where Diana tries to solve her problems, quote unquote, like a human, or to the extent that Diana is now admitting that she's using some magic, with the relationship with magic with which she is at least comfortable by virtue of having done it for so long. Even if she's now going, whoa, 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 maybe this is not what I think it is, she's still able to suppress it because it's still a method of problem solving and a method of confronting conflict with which she is fluent. And the idea both that the puzzle's bigger than she is, but that the problem's bigger than she is and she can't solve it, it really resonates with me. And hooray and huzzah, you were so smart.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you. Yeah, and I think the one, important fact that she keeps coming back around to, and maybe the question currently that is most bothering her, is in fact, why is Matthew so important? And I think we can talk about that some more when we get later in the book, perhaps.
So I hadn't considered that before. What about that scene makes you think that the thing that she backs off from is Matthew?
Because she talks about how his...
Oh, never mind. She says, why is the vampire so important?
She does.
I apparently
It was a quote that I didn't quote. I'm sorry.
Text 1, Catherine 0.
And before that, she states that his face is the one thing that keeps coming up again and again and again, but no other part of this problem is being solved for her. And since we know she's already irrationally irritated with Matthew, the fact that he keeps coming up again and again and again is one of the things where she's like, oh, and I'm done. It's not going to help me solve the problem I actually, in my conscious, think that I want to solve, but it is also bringing to mind the problem that my subconscious is actually thinking about, which is, why is Matthew so important? Why is he here? Why do I keep interacting with him? And then she asks herself, why is he so important?
Yes, I see that now. I like the symmetry between the book as a fulcrum for Diana versus herself and Diana versus the world of creatures, and that in that interpretation of the puzzle scene, Matthew does the same thing. I really like that symmetry, and I think that is gorgeous.
Yeah, it's good stuff. It's good stuff right there.
Excellent.
What do you think about, just an oddity from the beginning of this chapter, what do you think about Diana calling boiling eggs and doing laundry cherished rituals? Is it because she doesn't have a life and she's trying to create this humane existence, this average human existence for herself, but she has she's like, everybody, these are the things I love doing on Sundays. And not only that, when we get to chapter 12, she acts like she has no clean clothes. So did she even do laundry?
Do you even launder, sis?
She's just she's a poser. She just says she does laundry and she doesn't.
Look. I personally don't take that much enjoyment out of boiling an egg. I don't foreclose the possibility that other people could be like, you know what, that really floats my boat, but not for me.
And I could see the tea and the sitting and the ruminating, sure.
But we've already talked a little bit about Diana's essential loneliness and Diana's attempt to be as mundane as possible. And so maybe that's what she thinks normal humans do. I love this image of her just trying to blend in with other humans, being like, what did you do this weekend? I boiled eggs.
And I did my laundry, but I didn't really do my laundry.
Apparently I didn't do enough laundry, or I didn't do my sexy laundry. Perhaps that was the problem. Because everyone has different loads of laundry,
underwear
right?
Only?
Hey, there's no indication that Diana's a great housekeeper or anything, so I digress. But yeah, I definitely think that's weird. It's weird.
It's weird. It's funny. I think it's just a quirk, and I think you're right that it's just her trying to act normal. Act normal. Nobody will notice.
So the next day, we have Diana go to the library, and she's already so accustomed to Matthew that she's sort of like, when he's not there. And Miriam gives her this very tart sort of like, get your own stuff together, girl, because you are putting him in an impossible situation. And Diana sort of goes,
yeah. What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
And then she gets angry at Miriam, and we have the Sparkies.
Her finger electricity. This is yet another. So we talked about the jolt from the yoga in chapter 3. Sorry, in episode 3, we talked about that jolt from the ground of the yoga. And so this is yet another new to us manifestation of Diana's magic. She indicates that it used to happen when she was younger, but that it hasn't happened for a very long time. And so we get this. And so it's yet another piece of Diana's, I guess, shroud of humanness unraveling. Her facade is like just unraveling by the minute.
You might say it's catching fire.
And you might say that. Yes.
So she has this interaction with Miriam that so derails her that she's unable to get any work done. And she leaves the library only to discover that there are dozens and dozens of creatures expectantly waiting in the library for her descent. She gets super determined over lunch and is up to no good, basically, and that's the point at which she confronts Peter Knox. So what did you think about this confrontation?
I actually really enjoy this because I think it's one of the first times that Diana is being proactive rather than reactive so far in this book. This is the first time where she's like, I'm real fed up with everything, and I am the only one who can fix this, and I am going to. I am not just going to like huff and puff and complain that things are not going my way or that creatures are bothering me or that, I'm actually going to go and solve the problem or at least make the attempt in an active way.
Isn't it interesting, though, that you basically get 2 times in this chapter, once from Sarah and once from Miriam, where it's like, take care of your own self. Like, get your own stuff together and make a decision.
And she's like, all right, I will.
As a matter of fact, I shall. And we talked about this earlier, but one of the aspects of Diana's characterization is that she goes from being a little bit self-involved and kind of wishy-washy and reactive to being really decisive and taking matters into her own hands. And she does that sometimes somewhat recklessly. Like, I think there's a strong argument to be made that this is quite reckless because she doesn't know what she's doing. And I think it's part of her trying to keep that puzzle small, to try and keep it like solve this problem the only way she knows how, which is to say, everybody just disperse. There is nothing to see here.
And yeah, I mean, she doesn't know what she's doing because she goes directly to who she doesn't know is Peter Knox, but we will find out in our later chapters in this reading that it is, but it is the witch who threatened her, but trying to invade her mind, goes directly to him first and is like, can you get out of here, please? I don't know who you are or what you want or like what you're capable of.
And then she goes out to these 2 vampires that she has identified
the scary sisters.
that she has identified as being particularly intimidating and also apparently not of Matthew and Miriam's pack, such as it were.
Clan, whatever.
So that she feels like she needs to make a separate statement to these 2 sisters about, leave me alone. There are other vampires watching me already. Go find your own stuff to do. And then, of course, she goes to the demons who, and the latte-loving demon is pretty chill about it. Just like, hey, is it okay if I sit over here?
Woo.
Can I sit here?
Woo. Yeah. And I love, so that one scary sister, I didn't write down her name. And it doesn't matter textually. It's how she says that she's very entertained by Diana challenging Peter Knox, a child. And she says, a child like you challenging Knox. And Diana has absolutely no idea what that means, but we're led to believe it's serious business and that even the vampires are amused.
And this chapter and the next chapter spend a lot of time sort of putting Diana in a perspective where she's a little bit diminished until she starts pushing back, like treating her like a child the way that Knox treats her. Sarah even saying, you know, you're so undisciplined and reckless and immature and you've brought this upon yourself. And so Diana is sort of on her heels for a good portion of this chapter until she starts fighting back. And I was curious actually about how little notice Diana seems to take of her own power and agency. Like on page 120, where she talks about the rules that Matthew has clearly, if silently, laid down. It's like, hey girl, hey, do you remember yesterday when you told them all to sod off?
Yeah.
Did that not count?
Maybe to her it didn't count. She was like, I did nothing.
Right. And then our buddy Gillian Chamberlain shows up, and she's kind of the worst.
So Diana is active and has agency and does something about her situation, and then immediately gets pushed back. Immediately something happens. And we get Gillian, who is the worst and very like malevolent and awful.
Oh, absolutely. And sort of Gillian as a very personalized proxy for everything that is going on in the wider world of witches in particular, and a witch who clearly takes the history so seriously. She's an interesting contrast to Diana. Again, like, the bishop thing comes up a ton in this conversation, and about how Diana is essentially an heir to the problems that Bridget Bishop created for all witches. And that seems not only super malevolent, but also really unfair.
And also not true.
And I'm curious what you think about this conversation about independence that Gillian and Knox seem to suggest is a particular problem for witches. Where do you think that comes from?
I think, and it kind of goes back to the beginning where Sarah and Em were trying to get Diana to hang out with the local coven of witches, which includes Gillian, by the way. And I think they're trying to get Diana to think that she shouldn't be on her own because they want the book. And they're trying to give her this fear that if a witch is by herself, that or if a witch acts independently, that is bad for that witch and also bad for like creatures and witches in general. And it's because they want the book. They want her on their side, you know?
But how interesting that Sarah and Em should also have a perspective on witches that is based in community and in wanting Diana to be around other witches that doesn't seem to have the same flavor of witches who strike out on their own are not just more vulnerable, but they are actually undermining and betraying other witches.
So I think from Sarah and Em's perspective, it is more genuine in that they want to protect Diana, and that historically having safety in numbers, having a coven is safer than, because you can have people who will watch your back, is safer than acting independently. But from Gillian and Peter Knox's perspective, they're using that same history and using that same idea and kind of witch lore and superstition to their own gains.
Do we think that Gillian was present? Like, do we think that Gillian is older than she seems? Because she talks about Rebecca and Stephen as though she was there when the witches went looking for what Rebecca and Stephen had.
Yeah, and I always, in the beginning of the book, I definitely read Gillian as being more Diana's age.
Me too.
So now I can't decide if she is in fact older and she's either disguising it or if we just weren't given enough of a description of her in the beginning, or if she's one of those people who is full of themselves enough to talk about events that they never witnessed in a way that implies that they did. You know, in a way that implies that they are part of it because they want to make themselves more important. I'm not sure which it is, though.
Yeah, and Peter Knox does the same thing, too. It's interesting for me that later on when we talk about Matthew and vampires and how Matthew talks about other vampires, perhaps it is a species distinction, but vampires don't tend to use this sort of royal we type thing to discuss like the global community of vampires. That appears to be strictly sort of a witchy thing, and I don't know where it comes from.
I don't know either. just a different community feeling, I guess. I'm not sure.
Speaking of Peter Knox, I think that the encounter in Marcia's office is just basically straight antagonism. I don't know that there's a ton that's really chewy in there other than him continuing to patronize and sort of try and bully her into submission. And she ends up pushing back and saying, get away from me, like, I want nothing to do with you. But she's clearly rattled enough that she rings Matthew.
Right. And I think... Yeah, but I think it's important from a character's perspective to understand the lengths that Peter Knox will go to. And this isn't even that bad, but he's manipulating humans to get what he wants. And he basically has no qualms about doing whatever it is, whether he sent Jillian, he's using the Dean, he's using and he's using his power. He's using magic. It's not like he's just like acting in a human manner. Like he's actually using his magic on humans to get what he wants.
And with a great deal of disdain and contempt while he does it. For humans and for the importance of human lives and human autonomy. And his contempt for other creatures is very clear. We get this very menacing and very sort of dark interpretation of what the book might be. The idea that it is a tool for the destruction of vampires or to somehow corral demons and make them serve witches. And so I think that his species bias is arguably the worst in the book, because in part because he's the antagonist, but also because he clearly sees everything as a tool for enhancing his own power and does not... To be fair, he takes Diana at the face value for everything that Diana has tried to be.
Yeah, and I think, other than his just outright antagonism towards Diana, really the only other things we get out of this are we get the first discussion of the first witch, which is a discussion that will continue through the 3 books. We get a mention of the first witch, and we get him he's trying to kind of like push a wedge between Diane and Matthew and him talking about 1859, which doesn't turn out to be that important, and it's not really a spoiler to say it's not important.
No, it's not as important.
He kind of makes it is false. It is a false conflict note, I think. And it doesn't sit right because...
Right, it doesn't sit right, but I think that's partially because it is treated with a certain amount of gravity, and it's later addressed pretty squarely in a way that does...
Like they just have a conversation about it and then it's done.
But maybe that's the important part, right? Is that Matthew and Diana resolve that thing that could have been a big source of mistrust, where she just finally asks him about it and he gives her an answer.
Right. But I think that's also, the indication of false conflict is like often something that like if these two characters got into a room together and openly addressed whatever this thing was, and if it wasn't a problem, then that's false conflict.
And I think that there was potential for it to be real conflict if Matthew had not made the decision after his visit with Hamish to be honest. Or as honest as he's capable of being, and we will discuss the extent to which Matthew is actually being honest with Diana about things, because one of the things I don't like about Matthew, and that I do tend to think is patriarchal BS, is that there are things that he chooses to tell her and not tell her, and sometimes the stuff he doesn't tell her would have been really nice to know.
Yeah.
But we can talk about that later.
So that was important. But this, and I think it would have worked better also if this 1859 thing that happens were a little bit more important. And it's not.
If it had something more to do with the larger conflict, maybe, but it kind of just has to do with when it tumbles out, it has more to do with understanding and contextualizing Matthew, and that's why it's a disconnect.
Yeah. And we're like, all right, so moving on.
And so Matthew reappears. I think it's interesting that when he is agitated or aroused or angry, his scent is stronger, and I wonder if that's just
It's like sweat.
Right. It's like maybe that's just sweat, or maybe that's just like vampires emit like a great deal of smelly energy when they're upset. I don't know.
To tell other vampires that they're upset? Maybe. I don't know.
What do you make of the fact that Miriam and later other vampires will sort of try and deliberately provoke conflict between Matthew and Diana by telling Diana things that Matthew doesn't want her to know or that are considered to be impolite for vampires?
I think it might be a little bit of speciesism there. Also, vampires thinking, all of the creatures should not intermingle, I guess, and to kind of like get Diana to go away. And also maybe a little bit of protectiveness that this is dangerous for both of them. And it's really not a good idea for them to be together. And so kind of like actively trying to drive a wedge between them with varying degrees of success. I do like, though, at the beginning of chapter 11, there's a little moment of camaraderie between Miriam and Diana, where Miriam kind of respects what Diana has done. And she talks about how she wishes she were bigger and that she was impressed with what Diana did, And I think that's kind of a lovely little moment between them.
It is. It is a moment of reevaluation where Miriam has some more perspective on Diana and what Diana is capable of, but I think Diana also has more perspective on herself. And when she finally tells Matthew that she has been lying to herself and says, "You're right, I have been breaking my own rules for as long as I can remember, and I use magic all the time," and then she admits her fear to him. And again, maybe this is why pushing back on some of the vampire trope is more successful in these books than elsewhere, is because Diana's fear is not based necessarily in his vampiricness. In his identity, it's more based in hers.
Yeah, it's not a direct fear of vampires or a direct fear of him.
And again, there are only a couple times in the series where I think that Matthew unfairly or inappropriately leverages fear specifically of vampires. I think that there are times when there's at least one time that I can think of that he deliberately does it to provoke Diana into realizing how vulnerable she is in the larger world, which is not great. Anyways, it seems like there are only a couple times in the series where Matthew inappropriately leverages the fear specifically of vampires. I think that it is worthwhile to point out that both Matthew and Diana are afraid of who they actually are. We had that conversation about civilization and barbarism with Matthew, where he believes himself to be a monster, and he's afraid of his inner monster, and I think Diana is frightened of the same kinds of things, and specifically she's afraid of the potential for undisciplined and unearned power, and that those are really nice parallel fears to have.
Yes, I concur. And we also get the Dodo moment about her sweater. What? My sweater, you say?
Yes. I have an annotation next to that that's just like, think, Diana, think.
Very hard.
And I don't know what else to say about it, other than that both Matthew and Miriam have tried to spell out for her what the problem is, and she's like, derp, 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 derp.
Yeah. What did we equate it to? Chocolate chip cookies? In our side conversation.
Yeah, I think I said that Diana is basically like the tastiest chocolate chip cookie, and she just keeps waving herself in front of Matthew, and he's like, dude, I'm on a diet.
No carbs for me. And she has rubbed herself all over this piece of clothing and left it in his car.
And no chocolatey witchy carbs that are probably like much stronger for having sweat after yoga.
Yeah. Smart Diana.
And I kind of have conflicting thoughts about the Pilgrim's Badge and about Matthew having this, like, I don't know, I might hurt you thing. Because, again, that's one of the less successful parts of the vampire trope for me. Potentially rescued because vampire versus human versus vampire versus witch is a slightly different dynamic to have, because she certainly has inherent power of her own, and she is not just prey in certain ways, like she's a predator of her own species. And even so, it is not my favorite aspect. it only works for me, I think, because it is rooted in Matthew saying, it is not because of my hunger, it is because of my anger, and I do not trust my anger. And even though that is not, it's certainly one of his weakest traits, it's one of the problems with him as a character, is that he does have some uncontrolled or poorly managed anger issues.
To me, it also speaks a little bit to his propensity to wallow. A bit, because I don't believe he needs that at all. He thinks he does. He wants the reminder. He, as we will address again, has this habit of wallowing more than he should in some cases.
He has a great capacity for self-flagellation, which is very medieval.
It's very medieval,
to be fair.
And in a lot of ways, it makes him a more palatable character because he has self-reflection. He does tend to go overboard.
Yes, and his the desire for Diana, I think, is helped by the context of the mating instinct, the fact that he has specifically said that he's not going to give in to any kind of hunger, and because he's extraordinarily aware of the destructive power of his own anger. I contrast that to sort of an Edward Cullen thing, where I think that the Twilight vampire hunger and sexuality thing is much cruder, and it's also not as thoughtful as this is, where we get a great deal of discussion later on about vampire ethics as far as sexuality and blood and what it means to... I lost words. I lost them.
Yeah, I read it more as melodrama. I mean, I like the gesture that I look at it and I'm like, so Matthew, you're being a little goth. You're being a little melodramatic. Like you literally have this Lazarus coffin under your shirt.
True. And perhaps I would be more concerned. I was just thinking about how would I feel if this were absent from the story? How would I feel if this were handled differently? Would it work for me if Matthew were not concerned at all about the fact that Diana is his favorite food?
Cookies!
Would that bother me if we didn't have a conversation about it? And I think perhaps it would. If Matthew were not afraid of either his really fundamental need to eat and the fact that Diana is a stumbling block in that sense.
Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm stuck on the fact that we basically made him the Cookie Monster now.
Nice. Fair enough.
I'm having trouble. I'm very mature.
It's totally fine. So I think that looking at it, I still don't like it as a part of what feels like a necessary part of the vampire trope, but it's also not as bad as it could be.
No. Yeah. Yeah. And you're right. If it wasn't there, it would be more problematic than having it.
I think you'd have to dispense with it another way, and I cannot think of a successful way to do so.
Mm-hmm. I, however, like its usage later in the series, so I appreciate that we have it in the end.
I would like to... Yes. So, very briefly, I think that by the time we get to book 3, the relationship between Matthew's hunger, Matthew's anger, and Matthew's ability to control himself is much better contextualized. And so as I read it back, having finished the series, it works a lot better for me now than I think it did in the first book. I was like, oh, really? Are we doing this? And then I go back and I'm like, yeah, no, that's fair. That's just another really, like, a super slow burn.
Which is great, and I appreciate the world building.
For sure. Can we talk about the owl?
Yes. Go.
Do you know what owls and deer are symbols of?
Yes.
The goddess Diana. And I think that it's interesting that over the course of the books, we discover that Diana not only does not have a taste for venison, but when she eats it, she has like a visceral reaction to it. And she talks about trying to get the taste out of her mouth. And we have some indications later on that she has a relationship with deer. And then we get this thing with this owl, and this owl, which, again, as a symbol of Artemis and Diana, is essentially interrupting. It is, I don't know what it's doing, but I felt like it was purposeful.
Actively inserting itself in like, hello!
Right, and like a symbol of the goddess. And I'm not really sure what that means here, other than to say that it really struck me this time through, that I think that's what that is.
I think perhaps to redirect the attention to where it needs to be for these two characters in the story. I will also say that owls in some cultures are also symbols of death, harbingers of death. And if you see an owl, that's, danger and death. So not that that is necessarily relevant to this particular story in this particular place, but I think it's an interesting note. But I think the owl interrupting what could otherwise be another like flirtatious little moment and bringing them back to the danger at hand and the problem at hand, and in a way kind of pushing their story along.
Yes, it forces her to be vulnerable to him in a way that opens up further conversation. And like, to be vulnerable, no, she has an anxiety attack, and it moves them forward in a discussion of how often does this happen and what is going on. And she's finally like, well, it's not just about these people, these creatures coming upon me. I've actually been having sort of outpourings of power that are
magic that I can't control.
Right. And I think that that's necessary. And
I will say too, I know we don't officially talk about adrenaline for a few chapters, but I would like to address it here for a moment, which is that Diana's panic attacks and this excess adrenaline that we have, and knowing that prey also put off adrenaline that vampires can smell as predators, and that so having that excess adrenaline is basically a signal to a predator and kind of stimulation for a predator. And so the fact that he is able to, with this kind of constant barrage of like, eat me, eat me, eat me, coming off of Diana, Matthew is able to care for her, like without pause really at all, and is able to, I mean, he did run away to Scotland kind of because that was a little bit of a problem, and he's just come back. And he has this badge, and we've had this whole discussion of him, like killing other women and like all of this stuff that we know from Matthew's violent past. And now we have Diana having a panic attack, and he is able to immediately step into a caregiver role for her, which I think is enormously important.
I think it is too, and I think, again, that's a slow burn for the end of the book, but the instinct that is driving them together is stronger than the instinct that either of them have to do what either of them would ordinarily do. And the amount of gravity that is created between them by the fact that he's able to, not only that he's able to care for her, but that he wants to. And there's this interesting moment here where Diana, much like she does at several other points later in the book, sort of squares up to him and says, I would rather choose one potentially dangerous vampire than an entire world of creatures who have done nothing but threaten me. Your threat to me, you acknowledge your threat to me and that you don't seem to want to act on it. Whereas these other creatures are delivering veiled threats, and they are simply trying to make my life a living hell.
Like, it's basically been a barrage of threats on her in various ways by creatures since the beginning of this book.
And I think it's fair that Matthew's pushback to, like, I don't know that you really want to do this and be friends with me is not specifically about her. It's, you cannot, I am what I am. And what I accept about myself is that you are a danger to me and I am a danger to you. But that would be true regardless of whether we were Matthew and Diana or whether I was me and you were just a woman on the street or a warm blood that I saw elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. And we get this acknowledgement of Diana's isolation, which I think is great. And Matthew talks about how Knox was right to warn Diana against him. And now they're friends. Quotes, air quotes.
Air quotes, right? But I would just like to say darn it, Matthew. Because when he talks about vampire relationships being complicated and being possessive and protective, like, now would be a really good time to start introducing some of those concepts. Like, now would be a really good time to say,
right,
it's school time with Matthew, and we're going to have a little Vampire 101.
Yeah. Because we know and he knows that she knows nothing about anything, including vampires, much less vampire relationships. Yeah.
And it's a frustrating moment because in the one sense she exercises a certain amount of agency by saying, no, I choose you for reasons that are not bad ones. And he has an opportunity to give her more agency and say, I would like for you to make a full and informed decision without me being cryptic and weird about my tendency to be protective. I think that is underselling it by a mile and a half.
And also giving her power in the form of knowledge about the creature world that she does not possess.
Which could be very useful later on.
Yeah, and not just with him.
And the worst part is, it's not that he's not telling the truth. It's that he's doing the Matthew thing where he doesn't tell the whole truth.
Calling it complicated is not an explanation.
Because sometimes...
And that's really only the header of that whole thesis about how complicated it is.
Right. And it's just one more sort of like Matthew and patriarchal BS, where... she deserves to know. And it's interesting to me that how much pushback Matthew gets over the course of the book about his relationship with the truth vis-a-vis Diana.
I have a question about his brooding in this sense, because he doesn't, in this way he broods by, being cryptic. And do you think that is Deborah trying to make him broody-er than he already is? Because I don't find it to be a necessary character trait in any of the books, but it is consistent. So I'm wondering if it's like this attempt to make him this like brooding, old, like cryptic, full of secrets. And sometimes that's successful, and sometimes it is absolutely not.
Right. I think that Matthew's age is much more successful for me in the next chapter. And if that is an attempt to express his age and his relative worldliness, I think that it falls a little bit flat for me because it is so weak as to be unnecessary. That makes sense. Like, I think that
and it comes off as patronizing. Like, it doesn't come off as anything other than that most of the time.
Right. Shall we have dinner?
Yes. Let's have our first dinner, as air quotes, friends.
Yeah, because friends totally bring special wine to other friends' houses.
Yeah, just a one-on-one with candlelight and lots of wine. That is how I prefer to have my friend dinners.
I would like to say I only have one of those friends, and I am married to him.
Yes. Yeah, me too. So, okay, Diana, keep lying to yourself.
And then Diana does the weird self-deprecating, how do I look thing. And she wonders again what makes her mother look so different. And I have a note that says, love you, goose, at the top.
Yeah.
That's how you look at people that you love, is with a certain amount of the happy heart candy eyes.
And she's just she's very insecure. And, that's part of her characterization. And I think it works because she's not comfortable with anything that's happening, and it comes across in a lot of cases as just being really self-critical. And I have my question here: does Diana ever do laundry? Because we have several pages of her going through her dirty laundry in this chapter.
Maybe she's just not very good at laundry.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what that is.
As discussed. And then we get more information. She goes on a little biological discovery of what wolves and therefore assumedly vampires might actually
Which
eat.
is...
It's like a nature walk with Diana. Yes, a little Nat Geo special episode with Diana.
That doesn't throw me out. I think it's kind of silly and kind of sweet.
I think it's very nice.
I think it's a lovely gesture where she's trying to do something very nice for somebody who is completely foreign to her. And
yeah, I think the level of effort is very telling.
Yes, and I appreciate that he takes it in such extraordinary good grace when she finally fesses up and says, I asked people what to feed wolves.
And Googled it. Googled it and literally called a wildlife biologist.
Yes, but then she calls it the net. And I just sort of shake my head and I can't.
Yeah.
I can't with that.
Anachronism much. Even when this book was written, that wasn't anachronistic.
Right. So not the best word choice. We have the sort of conclusion, I think, of the third instance of Diana finally realizing what it means for Matthew to smell her and why he's always asking her out for meals.
Right. Finally. But yeah, it's her again trying to be coy and flirty, and I'm over here like, danger, Will Robinson, danger, danger. And I'm going to have another moment like that in our next episode.
For sure. And, Matthew does his best. And this is actually one of those moments where he's exasperated and patronizing to her, and I think she totally earned it.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, he is within his rights to be like, look, honey. He, leans back in his chair. And is like, obviously we need to chat.
It might be more successful for me, honestly, if he used the Socratic method. It's like, what do I eat? Okay. What are you? Okay. What do you know about me? Oh, that I have a really strong sense of smell? What do you think you smell like? And what do you think the smell of a full English breakfast does to that?
And there we have our answer.
That would have been too professorial if he'd actually gone through with that, but there are some ways in which I feel like he would have been within his rights. Because I think that Diana is just not using her formidable brain. I think that maybe that's also a character note where she's decided not to apply her formidable brain to this because her formidable brain is leading her to conclusions she doesn't want.
Is it the wine? Is it the hot vampire? Is it the flirting? We don't know. Is it the combo? A dangerous combination, it turns out, for Diana.
Because I totally get verklempt over a glass of Riesling and raw salmon.
And a hot vampire. I do think a little bit this whole effort she's putting in is a little bit of her making up for breakfast, which she knows he wasn't able to eat and she was a dodo about it anyway. And kind of now she's putting forth considerable effort to make sure that he's comfortable. While she does flub it a little bit by asking stupid questions.
And it's a nice rounding out of the conversation they had where he talked about liking to go through the rituals. And at the end of this chapter, he says, it's been a really long time since somebody tried to make a meal for me and showed that level of care, where some of it is the ritual of sitting down to have a meal with somebody. And I think that Hamish is different because that meal is not for Matthew.
I was going to say, point of order.
Yes. I think that's different because that meal was not for Matthew. It was something to which Hamish said Matthew would specifically not object, whereas Diana has gone out of her way to try and create something that they can enjoy together across their differences, and she has made a purpose of saying, well, wine's important to you, so I'm going to try and do that right, and I'm also going to try and see if there's anything that you can actually pick up a fork and eat with me, because that level of communion and that level of giving and food as an expression of strong emotion is important.
And I guess the difference would also be that Hamish understands creatures and clearly knows, what vampires are like, whereas Diana, as we've discussed many times before, has no knowledge of that. So Hamish having dinner with Matthew and having a chef who happens to be creative and like to try new recipes is different than Diana doing that. So we do get our final "How old is Matthew?" third beat in our it's not really technically a 3-beat because there's not really a subversion, but it is 3 times that he gets asked, or we're questioning about his age, and we get the final answer.
And the answer is very old indeed.
Super old. Not quite old enough to know Socrates or Plato, but at least 1,500 years old.
I actually love the moment where she's listing off all the things that could have potentially happened while he's been alive, and she mentions the fall of Carthage, and he goes, which fall of Carthage?
Yeah. Implying the one but not the other.
Correct. But also there's a great deal of charm in there, where he is clearly, there is a part of this that she has more currency with the times in which he's lived than perhaps anybody else would. And so she understands the weight of the world that he's witnessed. So that's super cool. I also, you have this paragraph where he says, damn you, Hamish Osborne. And then he deliberately hurts himself. I think that's a representation of how painful it is to tell her the beginning, like that beginning of who he is and where he comes from.
Yeah, I think we get a lot of vulnerability from him in this moment, and we get a lot of pain in the text, like you said. And I think if you think of someone who has lived for 1,500 years, they are several centuries beyond, more than several centuries beyond, having lost as many people as they've known, which in 1,500 years is quite a few people.
And loss is a big thing for Matthew, and it's a thing that he struggles with over the course of these 3 books, is the loss of people he cares about, and as they become closer, the impending and eventual loss of Diana.
Yeah, and I mean, at this point, the number of people who are older than Matthew is a very small number. And
he probably knows them all.
He probably knows them all, yes. Yeah, and I find that to be really tragic and really, really sad to know that you are going to outlive everybody, potentially, and the number of people who are going to outlive you is, again, going to be an even smaller number.
Right? And that the world that birthed you no longer exists. Nothing about...
Like, even a similar world does not exist.
Nothing about who you were before you became this thing is around anymore, or if it is so far outside of time to be almost meaningless, or meaningless to anybody but you. And that's just got to be so immensely sad. And again, maybe Matthew as a vampire works better for me than an Edward Cullen, just because, for instance, in Twilight, they don't commit to the age. You know, Edward's only like 130 years old or something, where he really hasn't had
It's not that much older than humans.
No, it's in at least like the sci-fi range of potential human lifespans, whereas Matthew is another thing entirely.
Matthew is older than Matthew is not even biblically old. Matthew is older than even the oldest person listed in the Bible, like older than anybody.
Older tthan dirt.
Yes. A lot of dirt, yeah. He's not quite a Nautilus, but yes.
And I think that, you know, without going too deeply into... Because I don't know that we need to. I think that the rest of the conversation is pretty straightforward in terms of the giving and receiving of secrets and the giving and receiving of intimacy in a way that leads them to this point where Diana, on impulse, one might say incredibly reckless impulse, decides that she's going to kiss him goodnight.
Although, I can relate to that much more than being like, what do I smell like?
Correct. The what do I smell like bit is that in this chapter?
Yeah.
Is it?
Yes. The other thing is in the next reading.
Oh, right.
The worst thing.
Right. The what do I smell like
is in the next...
And for those of you that would be interested, I did a longer post on what all of those smells mean in our real-time reading post for, I think it's October the 1st.
And it's delightful.
And needless to say, everything that is listed in that paragraph has enormous thematic significance for what is to come in these books about what Diana smells like. And the short version is she smells of new beginnings and possibility.
And a bit of, she also not only smells of new beginnings, but she also smells of things from Matthew's time. And not Matthew's original time, not like Matthew's beginnings, which I think is very important as well. And yeah, the rest of the chapter is like very fluffy. There's lots of flirting. There's lots of food discussion. There's lots of wine discussion. None of it really is particularly relevant or meaty. No pun intended.
Right. Other than to say that, just to pick up the tiny thread that we talked about earlier, Diana does confront Matthew about where he was in 1859, yes. And he tells her.
Yeah.
And he tells her.
He was like, I was talking to Darwin.
And that's sort of it. And maybe that's when the stone drops. Like, maybe that's when the turning towards one another is...
more complete.
And validated.
Yeah.
That he's willing to give her this thing. And... it's interesting that I wonder if it's because he's already given his age that that's not kind of a big deal for him, or if it's because that is actually not a big deal to him.
Yeah.
That being honest about that thing is not much of a challenge.
Right. And it's not even that big of a deal to us. It's really only significant because it lets us know how long Matthew's been looking for Ashmole 782, which is not that long, as it turns out. And it's only because he wants to know where we came from, and we already knew that about him.
And it closes the loop rather nicely with what Em and Sarah were saying, which is that he wants something, and he tells her precisely what he wanted, and he's wanted the manuscript for a very long time. And that bit of honesty, and also the fact that he's willing to say, this is where I was, this is what I was doing, and yes, I do want the same thing that you want, is a really nice refutation of what Em and Sarah and Peter Knox were afraid of. So,
and that's our reading.
Right, and there's some beautiful music associated with this that is also in the real-time reading, so you should go and queue up that playlist, grab a glass of wine, and enjoy it. And then swoon. Read it again and swoon.
Read it again and swoon, and just remember, a few seconds can change your life.
Put that on a bumper sticker.
Put that on a bumper sticker. Yep, t-shirt.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Chamomile and Clove. You can find us on Twitter at Chamomile in Clove, or you can email us at chamomileandclovecast@gmail.com. If you choose to use Twitter, please use the hashtag #CCAlchemy. It helps us find you.
It does, yes. And we will be attempting to re-record our Tragically Lost listener feedback episode very soon. So if you have more thoughts that you want to include, send them on to us, because then we will add them to our episode. And it will be lovely. And we have really enjoyed hearing from you and interacting with you all. And we're not ignoring you. We've tried to address all of your questions, but then the computer ate them. So, yes, thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to talking to you guys for our next reading, which is chapters 13, 14, 15.
Thank you very much, and good night.
Thank you. Bye.